Deep Sea Embers Chapter 371 to 375. Under the slate gray sky, Agatha found herself standing alone on the city street. The wind was as bitter as the frozen north, surging through the barren gap between towering buildings and ruthlessly assaulting her exposed face. It had a chilling touch that snapped her out of her pensive trance and back into the harsh reality. Despite the stark awakening, her mind remained consumed by a myriad of questions that threatened to shake the very foundations of her understanding and beliefs. Is it not the norm to commend those who take the initiative to report suspicions of heresy and frost? Is it possible that you've never operated a bank account? Does your church not engage in day-to-day interactions with ordinary folks? Did you fail to identify that what you saw was a bank account number? The mere thought that her most significant oversight in dealing with the ethereal could happen in such mundane circumstances was beyond Agatha's wildest imagination. She was certain that Bishop Ivan of the cathedral, and the passionate cryptographers and diviners who were tirelessly deciphering the cryptic numbers in the sacred hall, would share her astonishment. A rhythmic clatter of approaching footsteps broke her contemplation. Her subordinates, who had taken refuge in a shelter adjacent to the building, were closing in. One of the guardians, dressed in an austere black uniform, noticed Agatha's dazed demeanor and voiced his worry, "Are you all right? That house." Agatha swiftly raised her hand, cutting him mid-sentence. She took a brief backward glance, then laboriously moved towards a nearby steam-powered car, heavily reliant on her cane for support. Her voice was barely above a whisper, "Leave the inhabitants of this house undisturbed. Alert the local chapel and advise the guardians to steer clear from here. The silent cathedral will manage all direct communications with this residence." "Understood, gatekeeper," the black-clad guardian bowed in acknowledgement of his new directives. "Do you require some rest?" Agatha paused, then exhaled a weary sigh. "If it were possible, I'd immediately visit the closest church sanctuary or seek guidance from a reputable psychiatrist." The subordinate appeared startled. "Pardon. Never mind that. I don't need any rest." Agatha dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Let's head back to the cathedral. We need to initiate the search beneath the city-state immediately." The church's representatives have departed, Morris observed from the comfort of his window, keeping a keen eye on the street activity. As the gray-blue steam car vanished into the intersection, he turned to Duncan. "I was certain they'd leave behind a few of their observers. A gatekeeper in the Church of Death holds the same stature as an inquisitor in the Storm Church. She is bound by her promise. If she vowed not to cause disturbance, there wouldn't be any underhanded tactics," Vanna interjected from the side. "Moreover, she realizes that such actions would be futile." At this, Duncan quirked an eyebrow, shooting a glance at Vanna. "I half expected you'd want to engage with that gatekeeper. After all, both of you tread the same path. I struggle to envision any topic we could engage in." Vanna dismissed the notion with a shake of her head. "My standing is rather complicated. As an inquisitor of the Storm Church or a representative of the vanished, initiating dialogue with Frost's church at this stage would only invite unnecessary complications." Duncan grunted noncommittally, choosing not to comment. The silence stretched on until Nina's curiosity compelled her to speak up. "That gatekeeper?" None appeared rather enthused when she departed, as though she harbored some strategy. "What's this search plan?" she hinted at. "Uncle, do you have any insights?" Both Vanna and Morris simultaneously cast their inquiring gazes upon Duncan. After a thoughtful pause, he slightly nodded in agreement. Initially, he had been surprised, but now he had managed to puzzle out the situation. Agatha's response was a clear indication. After the fruitless searches within the main sections of the city-state, it appeared that the Church of Death had shifted its focus to the murky underworld. The second waterway. In the past, due to its prohibitive costs and logistical challenges, the authorities of Frost had chosen to leave the second waterway, a relic from the Queen's reign, dormant deep within the city-state's subterranean bowels. Their intervention was usually limited to occasional symbolic cleansing and sealing procedures within the upper sectors that connected to the waterway. However, the current circumstances seemed to suggest that they could no longer afford to worry about the cost implications. Duncan glanced up at Vanna. "Drop by Nemo's pub again later today and forewarn him. The church might be on the brink of launching an operation targeting the second waterway. He and his associates should remain on high alert." The second waterway was a sprawling network, and the section controlled by Nemo and his associates was but a small portion of the entire sewage system. This particular segment was intentionally concealed and sealed off, rendering it virtually invisible to the city's authorities and the church. Although it should theoretically escape detection, there was no telling just how resolved the church was in their current pursuit. Therefore, a precautionary alert seemed prudent. Moreover, the situation concerning Dagger Island is equally disconcerting, Duncan added after a moment of contemplation. The process leading to the island's vanishing is glaringly inconsistent with reason. I fear it may be a harbinger of more unusual events to follow. Morris, keep tabs on various city news, particularly in the districts near the eastern port, for any peculiar rumors. Morris acknowledged the instructions with a nod. Understood. We ought to alert Tyrion as well, to monitor any anomalies within that maritime zone. As Duncan stroked his chin, he quietly muttered to himself, meticulously reviewing his plans to ensure no detail was overlooked. At that moment, he noticed Shirley stealthily approaching him. Her movements were quiet and seemed somewhat surreptitious. What seems to be the issue? Duncan queried, adopting a casual tone. It's not an issue with me, it's about Dog, Shirley swiftly dismissed with a wave of her hand, then lifted her arm. A black chain magically materialized out of nowhere, at the end of which, Dog, who had taken a hasty retreat when gatekeeper Agatha showed up, now emerged before Duncan. Dog claimed he has something to report. An incident. Duncan frowned, his gaze landing on the apprehensive dark hound. What kind of incident? Dog shook his grotesque head and cautiously glanced towards the door before voicing his concern. I can't be entirely certain if I'm mistaken, but that gatekeeper named Agatha, I detect an aura about her that's strikingly familiar. An uneasy silence blanketed the room, and Duncan's eyes hardened instantaneously. A familiar aura. What are you suggesting? A shadow demon? No, not a shadow demon. Dog was quick to shake his head in denial. I'm struggling to articulate it clearly. You're aware, my memories prior to receiving a heart, or somewhat foggy, but that aura, it somewhat echoes the ambiance I experienced in the presence of the Nether Lord. Upon hearing Dog's revelation, everyone exchanged a flurry of perplexed glances, whereas Duncan, his expression grim, demanded, why did you not mention this earlier? I didn't dare to reveal myself just then. Dog recoiled slightly, she is a gatekeeper after all. Of course, she's no match for you, but given that Frost is currently sweeping the entire city for disciples of annihilation and shadow demons, I feared that exposing myself could lead to a misunderstanding, which might inadvertently impede your operations. Dog's justification held some weight, and Duncan decided against interrogating him further, but the situation it had reported certainly took everyone by surprise. Gatekeeper Agatha, the preserver of Frost, how could she possibly harbor the aura of the Nether Lord? Could it be, has the gatekeeper fallen from grace? Or has she been corrupted? Morris pondered aloud, his tone laden with concern. But her demeanor appeared utterly normal. There wasn't any discrepancy in her speech or behavior. Could she be oblivious to it? Shirley tentatively chimed in from the sidelines. Isn't it said that cognitive corruption is the most elusive to detect, particularly for the person at the heart of it? Duncan remained silent but shifted his gaze towards Vanna. She doesn't seem to have fallen or been corrupted, and she's definitely not an imposter. Vanna's brow furrowed as she slowly articulated her thoughts, revisiting the various nuances of Agatha. I didn't detect any abnormal aura emanating from her. Dog, are you absolutely certain about what you sensed? As I mentioned earlier, I'm not entirely confident if I interpreted the sensation accurately, Dog articulated, his voice resonating with a sense of unease. It was merely a subtle aura that echoed the profundity of the abyssal deep sea, it might not even be intrinsically hers. Besides, didn't she mention that she recently apprehended some disciples of annihilation? Even though they weren't particularly significant figures, wouldn't it be expected for her to have inadvertently absorbed some aura from the abyssal deep sea after incessantly dealing with them on a daily basis? Nevertheless, Duncan continued to furrow his brows. While Dog's rationale appeared plausible, he sensed that the situation wasn't that straightforward. Would a seasoned priestess, a gatekeeper, of the city-state, neglect to purify herself after interrogating heretics? Would she nonchalantly roam about, tainted by the aura of the heretics? Vanna stepped forward, posing a question: should we summon the gatekeeper here to clarify the situation? Or should we go to her? Neither. If she is indeed on the brink of falling or has forged an alliance with the shadowy entities, any direct interaction could potentially tip her off. Duncan shook his head, his gaze trailing in the direction Agatha had vanished. I'll stealthily monitor the situation. The rest of you should refrain from contacting her. Stealthily monitor. Vanna paused, about to probe what Duncan meant by stealthily monitor, when something seemed to jog her memory. Certain past recollections floated to the surface, leading to a sudden realization. You implanted a mark on her. She has seen me. Duncan responded with a slight nod. In his peripheral vision, a tiny green flame flickered softly at a spot a fair distance from their location. That was the direction in which Agatha had exited. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. As Agatha journeyed back to the cathedral, her mind was caught in a tempest of thoughts. The confirmation of the second waterway as the valid avenue for exploration had brought a slight wave of relief to her. Nevertheless, the mystery surrounding the identity of the enigmatic entity continued to disconcert her. It was now indisputable that this entity demonstrated a benevolent demeanor towards Frost. Yet, in her role as the leader and guardian of this city-state, she found herself grappling with the potential long-term implications of this relationship. Any higher order, transcendental being wouldn't simply engage in an observation of the mortal realm without an underlying motive. The act of such observation, in its own right, constituted a noticeable intrusion. A slew of questions kept her awake at night. How long would this shadowy visitor persist in observing their world? What could be the long-term impact of its enduring presence on Frost? Could the existence of the people in the city-state be fundamentally altered under such influence? Was the entity aware of the consequences of its presence? Or, was it a matter of complete indifference to it? The modest steam core emitted a robust, resonating growl, powering the mechanical vehicle to traverse the timeless streets of the city-state. As they journeyed, the scenery lining the edges of the road gradually retreated into the periphery of her vision, and the vehicle reduced its speed somewhat as they crossed another intersection. Ma'am, are we heading directly back to the cathedral? Her subordinate's voice punctured her contemplation from the driver's seat. Lifting her gaze, Agatha peered out of the car window, her gaze falling upon the familiar structure of the cathedral in the distance. The silent cathedral, as always, silently dominated the city-state's skyline. At the city's heart was a mountain, a rough conical landform that stood as the city-state's core. Beneath it were the rich ore mines that bestowed a wealth that seemed to have no end. At the peak of this mountain were two prominent edifices, the silent cathedral and city hall. These two grand structures, standing shoulder to shoulder at the city's highest point, were visible from every nook and corner of the city-state. At least one of them was always in view. With its grandeur and solemnity, the cathedral appeared hallowed against the backdrop of the infinite sky. Opposite it stood the city hall, another imposing structure. Half a century ago, during the reign of the Queen, this building had been a palace. Officially named the Winter Court, it was colloquially referred to by most as the Queen's Palace. In that era, now considered forbidden to discuss, the Winter Court and the Silent Cathedral stood as twin sentinels over the city-state, their symbolic protective forces captured in the mythology of old. The church safeguarded the city through the night, and the royal house stood guard during the day, their forces complementing each other in a harmonious balance. Despite the passage of time and the end of the Queen's era, the present-day reality wasn't drastically different. City Hall, embodying secular power, continued to stand as the caretaker of the city. Agatha found herself sinking deep into a contemplative state. Unconsciously, her gaze fixated on the mountain, a sight she had seen countless times, and the two buildings crowning it. These structures, to her, seemed like two titanic beasts perched at the summit. The multitude of houses and factories clustered on the mountain's flank appeared to her as rivulets of lifeblood flowing from these beasts, meandering down the slopes. A sudden, minor sting pricked at her eyes. Gatekeeper, shall we proceed to the cathedral? The voice of her subordinate once more echoed from the front seat, jarring Agatha out of her reverie. She blinked, registering a faint humming in her ears that vanished as quickly as it came, along with her momentary lapse into the memories of a time now past. No, Let's make our way to the sewage treatment center first, Agatha replied, shaking her head. The doppelganger that vanished in the washroom is a matter of concern. I need to verify the situation personally. Understood. With a lively hum, the steam core resumed its operation, and with practiced elegance, the car traced an arc at the intersection, directing itself towards the sewage treatment center. The sky was blanketed by a thick layer of clouds, with the feeble daylight managing to cast an eerie and uncertain glow amidst the shadows. In the distance stretched an endless expanse of sea with a thin veil of mist hovering over its surface. Lawrence stood at the prow of the White Oak, his brows knitted together as he stared at the far-off seascape, a sight that had remained constant for what seemed like an eternity. Glancing in the other direction, the sea extended to infinity there as well. No other ships were in sight, let alone any indication of a city-state. Lawrence's brows furrowed even deeper as a biting wind swept across the deck, tugging at his clothes and ruffling his white hair. How long have we been sailing away from frost? He suddenly asked the first mate standing beside him. A full day and night, Captain, came the immediate reply from the first mate, we've been at full speed. Something seems off, it feels as if we're going in circles. Lawrence's face hardened, his gaze darting towards the confused light in the sky, and then, as if recalling something, he asked, is the telegraph able to receive signals from the nearby city-states or ports? Yes, the first mate affirmed with a nod, his expression mirroring Lawrence's seriousness, but only from frost. Taking a shallow breath, Lawrence inquired, what does it say? The greeting message, the first mate relayed with deliberate slowness, the port is open, welcome to frost. The same message is being broadcast on repeat. Lawrence's brow furrowed even more at this revelation. After an extended silence, the first mate eventually voiced his suspicion, it's as if, we're still caught in Frost's vicinity. It appears we are ensnared within these waters, Lawrence stated, his voice low and laden with worry, how is the crew holding up? Everyone's caught on that something's amiss, but they're remarkably composed. The first mate glanced back towards the deck where the sailors were diligently going about their tasks, they're performing exceptionally well. We've encountered oddities in the boundless sea before, and everyone has faith that you can navigate us out of this predicament. Therefore, no one is imposing on you. Lawrence responded with silence, simply lifting his gaze once more to the disorderly sky. Observing his captain's unusual focus, the first mate couldn't help but ask, what is it that you're looking for? Lawrence rubbed his temple, feeling a peculiar emptiness in his mind, like he had mislaid something crucial. I'm mulling over our navigation path. Navigation path. Yes, the course, Lawrence intoned, his eyes forcefully shut and then reopened as he wrestled with the missing piece of information, the words seeming to be more to himself than to anyone else. Does it not feel like, we've forgotten something? Our current course, should we adjust it? Taken aback, the first mate stuttered out a response, adjust the course. Are you suggesting the observatory? The navigator? No, not the observatory. Lawrence abruptly cut off the first mate's speculation, appearing to slowly emerge from a long bout of mental fog. The observatory is reserved for special circumstances as it's contaminated and we can't rely on it frequently. There ought to be a simpler, more commonly used, safer method to confirm our direction during the day. There must be such a method. As he spoke, Lawrence's words sped up, and then, as though a light bulb had been switched on in his mind, he abruptly pivoted and dashed towards the captain's quarters, not providing any hint about his sudden recollection. Left bemused but instinctively following the captain, the first mate trailed Lawrence back into the captain's quarters, watching as Lawrence rummaged about the room. Eventually, he couldn't resist asking, what are you searching for? Some sort of device, used during daylight, to correct the course, Lawrence answered, his voice hurried as he continued his search, a potent memory starting to rise from the depths of his mind. He was on the brink of remembering, of knowing what he sought, and then, his gaze fastened on a table nearby. Nestled on the table was a small apparatus, made up of a telescopic tube and several uniquely marked scales. With hesitation, Lawrence approached and lifted the compact device, grappling with his memory to recollect its function. After a few moments, he exited the room, the little instrument securely in hand, and emerged on the deck. The first mate watched as Lawrence held the device aloft and directed it skyward. Captain, what are you attempting? The first mate questioned, unable to mask his curiosity. Lawrence carefully lowered the device, a fleeting glimmer of deep green sparking within his eyes, unnoticed by the first mate standing opposite him. The elderly captain's expression was a mixture of bewilderment and astonishment. He and the first mate locked eyes for several intense seconds before he finally managed in a hoarse whisper, "Do you recall, an entity in the sky that glowed and emitted heat, moving with unwavering accuracy and precision above us, which ships used to orient their course during daylight?" The first mate's eyes widened as if dormant memories or inklings were stirring within his mind. Turning his gaze back to the tumultuous clouds and the faint, seemingly sourceless light that lingered behind them, the light seemed to permeate uniformly, with no traces of a singular, intense luminous body amidst the cloud cover. Drawing his gaze away from the nebulous expanse above, he fixed his gaze on his first mate. "Where has the sun vanished to?" Confounded, the first mate could only echo the captain's query, "Where has the sun vanished to?" "We're not astray, not ensnared, not caught in a cyclical anomaly," Lawrence murmured softly, "the White Oak has sailed into an anomalous space." The first mate slowly raised his gaze, staring out across the vast sea beyond the ship's side, a blend of confusion and fear etched on his face. But suddenly, it seemed as if he'd discerned something. There, breaking the monotony of the seascape, was a sliver of land. A tiny island. The island was a peculiar sight, featuring a winding coastline snaking through steep, rocky cliffs, shrouded under dense fog. Its opaque veil concealed any clear visibility of its landscape, allowing only an indistinct perception of the uneven terrain. The bizarre shapes looming in the foggy backdrop could either be jagged outcrops of rock or remnants of collapsed structures. The fog made it impossible to tell. Its manifestation was startlingly abrupt, as if conjured from the ether in close proximity to the ship named White Oak. "What's that?" the first officer gasped, disbelief etched on his face as he squinted towards the looming silhouette of the island emerging from the distant sea. The recent epiphany about the sun had already sent a shudder of unease through him, a feeling which had yet to dissipate. Now, an island that had materialized out of nowhere had managed to unsteady this otherwise hardened sailor, hinting at an underlying fear in his trembling voice. "An island? Does an island exist near Frost? Was it plotted on our original course?" "The concept of a planned course no longer holds," replied Lawrence, the captain, his voice steady and soothing despite the baffling circumstances. Even though he too was taken aback by the sudden disappearance of the sun, he appeared to regain his composure quickly. "As for this island, I recall an island called Dagger Island, near Frost, but I can't confidently identify this as the same one. Its appearance doesn't quite align with the nautical charts." "What's our next move, Captain?" asked the first mate, shifting his gaze back to Lawrence. "Do we advance towards it? Or give it a wide berth?" The captain paused, mulling over the possibilities. The sudden apparition of the island, right after they had comprehended the concept of the sun, seemed too strange to be coincidental. Was its emergence somehow connected to their recent cognitive adjustment? Was the pervasive fog a true meteorological phenomenon or a deceptive illusion bred from cognitive dissonance? Did the island stay stationary? Was it even possible for the White Oak to evade it? Suppose the island's sudden appearance was an intentional act. In that case, it was conceivable that the island would continue to reappear in the ship's path regardless of the direction the White Oak took. Regardless of the uncertainties, a cautious approach dictated that they should avoid getting too close. "Avoid it," Lawrence instructed in a stern tone, "maneuver around it from the port side and make haste." "Aye, Captain." Upon receiving the order, the first officer made a swift retreat towards the ship's bridge. Shortly after, the piercing blast of the ship's foghorn reverberated across the White Oak. Lawrence could feel the ship subtly altering its course beneath his feet while the ship's steam engine, deep within its hull, unleashed a mighty roar, signaling an increase in speed. The sudden materialization of the island hadn't gone unnoticed by the sailors aboard the White Oak. Some crew members had ventured closer to the deck's edge, their eyes wide with apprehension as they watched the distant island cloaked in an eerie fog. As they watched, the ship progressively distanced itself from the island, leaving it to become a shrinking silhouette on the horizon. This allowed Captain Lawrence to heave a sigh of relief as he swiveled towards the direction of the ship's bridge. However, his stride faltered abruptly within seconds. A figure had emerged into his line of sight, a woman donned in a captain's uniform. Her slightly curled hair cascaded down her back, and her arms were folded over her chest. A faint, almost enigmatic smile danced on her lips. Do you recall what I told you? Her voice broke the silence, steeped in a resigned tone. You should have retired when you had the chance. Don't wait until my appearance on your ship becomes the catalyst for your regrets, Lawrence, you've aged. Martha. Lawrence found her name tumbling out of his lips reflexively, and without missing a beat, he plunged his hand into his pocket, his fingers desperately seeking the vial of potion. A surge of confusion washed over him. Why was she here already? Why did the potion's effects recede so swiftly? It hadn't even been a full day since Martha's last appearance. Could the potion's duration of effect have dwindled this drastically? His hand shook uncontrollably as he finally managed to secure his grip around the vial of potion. Just as he was about to unseal it, he felt a hand gently clasping his arm. In a blink of an eye, Martha had maneuvered herself to his side. Her hand found his arm, her touch surprisingly warm, and her eyes, filled with concern, bore into his. The potion is losing its potency. You must realize that, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If you drink it now, my phantom will disappear momentarily, only to re-emerge. If you empty an entire vial, my disappearance will be prolonged, but I'll eventually return. Lawrence, the potion is losing its effectiveness. I don't understand, Lawrence stuttered, his eyes fluttering as he gazed upon the face so familiar to him, only to be overcome by a chilling sensation engulfing his heart. I am aware of my mental state, and I trust the expertise of my psychiatrist, but why? Your cognition is deteriorating, Lawrence, can't you perceive it? These waters are meddlesome and affecting you, Martha murmured. The voice could have been Martha's, or perhaps the echo of Lawrence's subconscious realization. Deep within, the seasoned old captain had already started connecting the dots. The longer you remain here, the quicker your cognitive abilities will decay. Tread carefully, Lawrence, you're navigating the treacherous waters of the open sea. How do I escape this place? Lawrence found himself questioning reflexively, his fingers releasing their grip around the vial in his hand without conscious thought. The small glass container plummeted to the deck, shattering upon impact with a distinct, crystalline sound. A portion of the elixir seeped out from the remnants of the vial, blending seamlessly with the water pooled on the deck. Lawrence stared at the shards of the broken vial underfoot, his mind blank. With her hand still lightly resting on his arm, Martha whispered her directive, find your way to Frost. Her words jolted him from his trance. He snapped his head up to find the space beside him devoid of any presence. Only the residual warmth on his arm suggested someone had been there moments ago. Suddenly, the rhythmic patter of hurried footsteps approaching disrupted his stupor. Lawrence lifted his gaze to find his first mate hastening towards him. Captain, we've successfully distanced ourselves from the island, the first mate reported breathlessly. However, he then craned his neck, surveying their surroundings with an air of perplexity. Who was with you just now? A member of the crew. I was alone, Lawrence started, his response cut short as he registered the first mate's question. Wait, you're saying you saw someone with me just now? Yes, there was a woman standing next to you, but I couldn't make out her features, the first mate replied, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Did I misinterpret what I saw? Lawrence's eyes widened in sheer surprise, his expression startling the first mate. After a few tense seconds, he blurted out, you could see her. The first mate swallowed hard, taken aback by the captain's reaction. Yes, I did see someone. As the words left his mouth, a dawning realization seemed to unsettle him, his countenance turning grave. Wait, was I experiencing a hallucination? Has it affected me? It indeed was a hallucination, but, in theory, it was meant to be visible solely to me. Lawrence's face turned serious, a wave of apprehension washing over him. He gestured for his first mate to remain calm, even though his own mind was in turmoil. It shouldn't have been visible to anyone else. The veteran seafarer raised his head, his gaze wandering as if half expecting to catch sight of Martha's form. In his mind, the lines of demarcation began to blur, reality morphed with illusion, memories entwined with delusions. The boundary between reality and fantasy seemed to dissolve in this place. The hallucination that should have only existed in his perception had infiltrated another's vision. The unreal was materializing, but what about reality? Was this stretch of sea real? Was the white oak tangible? What was the true essence of this mysterious place? Lawrence's thoughts whirled in disarray, but they were abruptly shattered by the loud cries of sailors from somewhere along the ship's deck. The crew had detected something on the horizon. Exchanging a quick, meaningful glance with his first mate, Lawrence swiftly sprinted towards the ship's edge. As they peered over the railing, the cause for the sailors' outcry came into view. An island blanketed in a foggy shroud had materialized on the frontal side of the White Oak, its serpentine coastline and jagged rocky cliffs jutting into view. The island had reappeared. The island moves, the first mate swallowed hard, his face paling as his worst fears were confirmed. It's caught up to us. Or, it's possible we've been moving in circles, and this sea area is interspersed with veils that temporarily blind us, Lawrence offered, his voice barely a murmur as he kept his eyes glued to the island. We might even be sailing right alongside Frost. The first mate looked puzzled at the captain, clearly thrown off by the sudden mention of Frost. But he quickly composed himself and posed his question, Captain, what's our course of action this time? Do we continue evading it? Lawrence lapsed into a thoughtful silence, pondering for a moment. Martha's gentle directive echoed in his mind, go to Frost. Of course, the island wasn't the city-state of Frost he knew, but its repeated appearances in close proximity to the White Oak could be some kind of indication. Not too long ago, he had commanded the White Oak to hurriedly retreat from the ominous atmosphere enveloping the city-state of Frost, only to be ensnared in these uncharted waters. Now, Martha was directing him, instructing him to go to Frost. A peculiar island radiating an even more unnerving aura had cropped up before them, and not for the first time. Faced with such circumstances, what should his decision be? We set a course for the island. Tyrion found himself positioned on the impressively lofty bridge of the naval vessel, the Sea Mist. His gaze lost in contemplation, traversed through the expansive view offered by the wide frontal window, settling on the immeasurable ocean stretching out before him into the horizon. This was the direction where Dagger Island was supposed to be located, but now, all he could see was an enormous stretch of undulating sea. Like tiny specks in the distance, a smattering of scout boats were still conducting a seemingly futile quest for any trace of the lost island. Dagger Island had been missing from all charts and navigational tools for an extended period. Despite the relentless search efforts from the people of Frost and the Mist Fleet, not a single clue had surfaced from the purported region of the vanished island. Tyrion, a formidable pirate by reputation, let out a sigh filled with an ineffable mix of emotions. He turned away from the mesmerizing view, abandoning the bridge for the more private confines of his captain's quarters. In the interior of his private space, an ancient oval-shaped mirror dominated the desk, its antique design forming a striking contrast against the otherwise modern and technologically advanced ambiance of the Sea Mist. Drawn towards this piece of history, Tyrion approached the mirror and cautiously examined his reflection. A wave of hesitation seemed to fleetingly cross his features. However, he soon shook off his indecisiveness. Reaching into a drawer, he retrieved a beautifully carved candlestick intended for ceremonies and carefully placed it before the mirror. Sea Mist calling the vanished, Tyrion whispered into the silence. In that moment, he felt a kinship with those sailors who, in their final bouts of insanity driven by the illusions of the boundless sea, offered sacrifices while invoking the terrifying power that resided in the deepest, darkest abyss of the ocean. His situation was not vastly different. The entity he was invoking was indeed the most formidable power known in these waters. In fact, the terrifying power was none other than his father. The candlestick burst into flame of its own accord, the brilliant dance of the flame casting playful shadows across the room. The mirror reflected this eerie play of light and shadow, and Tyrion, anxiety creeping into his heart, observed the tiny flame. As it flickered several times before transforming into a ghastly green hue, he knew his call had been received. The oval mirror swiftly became a canvas of flames, its center turning an ominous pitch black. Tyrion's reflection disappeared, to be replaced, a moment later, by another figure, that of Duncan, his father's primary form, which resided in the vanished. Duncan was casually holding a piece of bread in his hand. He glanced upward at the mirror, a look of mild curiosity on his face. I was about to have lunch. Have you eaten? Not yet. Taken by surprise, Tyrion responded awkwardly. Duncan seemed to have subtly changed after regaining his human form, exhibiting a unique, albeit amiable, manner of greeting. This new approach was friendly, but it left Tyrion feeling quite uncomfortable. After all, he hadn't had such an informal, relaxed conversation with his father in what felt like forever. Eating your lunch punctually is beneficial for your health, Duncan advised nonchalantly. Now, what is it that you require from me? Despite a thorough search in and around the location of Dagger Island, we've turned up empty, Tyrion asserted, regaining his focus and steering the conversation towards the urgent matter. The individuals from Frost are relentlessly continuing their hunt, but I fear they'll meet the same outcome as us. The island was consumed by the deep sea. The crux of the issue lies beneath the water's surface. A surface search won't yield anything meaningful, Duncan said, shaking his head. Furthermore, we currently lack the appropriate diving equipment to conduct an underwater search. Also, the city is becoming increasingly tense. The church is planning to extend their search to the second waterway soon. Rest assured, I've already dispatched a warning to your informants. At the mention of the Death Church planning to search the second waterway, Tyrion felt a wave of tension sweep over him. However, Duncan's assurance that he had alerted Tyrion's informants eased his worry somewhat. Brows knitted in thought, he asked, did they suspect that there's a heretic stronghold hidden within the second waterway in the city? Considering they've already overturned the entire city-state except for this area, it's a logical suspicion, Duncan responded, an eyebrow raised. They're running out of places to search apart from the second waterway. Tyrion lapsed into thoughtful silence, his forehead creased in a frown. Observing his expression, Duncan inquired, what are you thinking? I highly doubt they'll uncover any leads in the second waterway, Tyrion said, shaking his head slowly. Even though my informants don't control the entire second waterway, they have a solid understanding of the happenings there and control several strategic points. If a substantial number of annihilators were hiding there, conducting large-scale rituals, I believe I would have received some intel. Maybe they've managed to hide extremely well, or perhaps the ceremonies they've been conducting have somehow distorted the perceptions of any informants who might have detected their activities. The informants either didn't notice anything, or if they did, they might have been corrupted, thereby preventing you from receiving accurate information, Duncan suggested. Tyrion nodded slowly. That is indeed a plausible explanation, particularly given your confirmation of the existence of cognitive pollution within the city-state. I will also maintain surveillance on the second waterway, Duncan assured him through the mirror. I'm equally curious about the whereabouts of these annihilation followers. If your informants encounter any difficulties during this operation, I'll extend as much assistance as I can. Thank you. I appreciate it greatly. Tyrion bowed his head respectfully in response. Their discussion was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected knock on the door of the captain's quarters. Someone's at your door, Duncan, alert to the interruption even through the mirror, noted, if there's nothing else you need, you should attend to your duties. Very well, father. As Duncan's form faded from the mirror, the flames followed suit, reverting the candlestick back to its original dormant state. Exhaling softly, Tyrion felt the burden on his heart ease slightly. His brow furrowed as he rose from his seat and opened the door. What's the matter? A speedboat from Frost has approached, the undead sailor standing outside the door, easily identifiable by the visible hole in his head, reported, saluting his captain. They are displaying flags and emitting light signals indicating non-aggressive action and request for contact, while drawing closer. It seems as though they are emissaries. Emissaries. Surprise flickered on Tyrion's face, but it was quickly replaced by a gleam of interest. Intriguing, it appears they can no longer contain their restlessness. Should we fire upon them? The sailor's eyes glinted with anticipation. Absolutely not. Allow them to come aboard, Tyrion commanded, shooting a stern glare at the eager sailor. He then added, only permit 3 individuals to board. If they don't agree, they can return whence they came. Aboard the mechanized speedboat, bearing the emblem of the city-state of Frost, a man adorned in a respectable suit and gold-rimmed spectacles stood on the deck at the bow. He repeatedly removed his glasses, wiping them nervously as he observed the formidable steel warship growing larger in his field of view. The sea mist, steadily drawing nearer, loomed like a colossal mountain afloat in the icy sea, exuding an increasingly palpable sense of oppression. Encircling the speedboat were floating fragments of ice, drifting like sentient entities in the oceanic expanse. The icy fragments seemed to deliberately circle the speedboat, persistently clashing against the hull near the waterline and striking an unsettling rhythm. The secretary, in a reflexive nervous habit, wiped his glasses again. However, his thoughts were inadvertently invaded by the folklore passed down through generations in Frost, tales of curses from the outer sea, the legendary pirate shrouded in fog, sailors turned into frozen statues within their dreams, and children's tales. We're close enough, the secretary, placing his gold-rimmed glasses back on, took a steadying breath and instructed the officer beside him, we should maintain this distance. Any closer, and that warship will surely commence firing. Reduce speed to minimum, make a left turn. The officer pivoted and bellowed his orders to the scout sailor. The mechanical speedboat promptly decreased its speed, making minor adjustments to its trajectory to align parallel with the colossal steel warship. Simultaneously, the officer was scrutinizing the movements of the sea mist. A sudden flash of light emerged from the warship, followed by the sight of a sailor brandishing a flag towards the speedboat. They're signaling, the secretary inquired in haste, what's the message? The sea mist has granted our request, thank heavens, it's a signal that a living being can comprehend, the officer visibly relaxed. He then noticed a small boat being lowered from the side of the warship, they're launching a vessel for transportation of personnel. May the god of death be with us, I assumed they would simply retaliate with gunfire. The secretary was also noticeably relaxed. As the inaugural envoy dispatched to negotiate with the Mist Fleet, despite his readiness to sacrifice himself for the city-state prior to his mission, he still experienced a sensation of relief akin to narrowly escaping a deadly encounter. The boat dispatched from the sea mist rapidly neared Frost's mechanical speedboat. On board were a handful of undead sailors donning old naval uniforms. The distinctive Queen's insignia on their sleeves and the uniforms, symbolic of a bygone era, were particularly conspicuous. But what was truly startling was their uncanny appearances as the undead. Two of them bore large, gaping holes in their heads, another displayed a cavernous hole through his chest, while one seemed unscathed, yet bore the bloated and horrifying countenance of a corpse submerged in seawater for days. Upon witnessing the arrival of these undead sailors, the Frost sailors aboard the mechanical speedboat felt a wave of nervousness wash over them. As they watched these spectral figures step onto their vessel, many sailors displayed an array of complex expressions. Regardless, the undead sailors appeared thrown by the attitudes of the living, who didn't cower in fear of them at first glance. Who is the envoy? That would be me, the man in the succinct suit and gold-rimmed glasses stepped forward promptly. He strived to regulate his anxiety and not gawk at the harrowing features of the undead sailors. Forcing a composed tone, he introduced himself, my name is Eddie Rule. I am Frost's representative in discussions with the Mist Fleet. A table clerk. The bloated undead sailor arched an eyebrow, casting a fleeting glance at the secretary, now identified as Eddie, and retorted with an air of derision, I thought at least a few military delegates would be sent. Has Frost's navy been drained of courageous soldiers? The accompanying officer was quick to step forward, poised to utter a response. However, Eddie promptly intervened before he could articulate a single word, raising his hand to silence him. I am indeed the envoy, the civilian functionary wearing gold-rimmed glasses asserted, locking eyes with the undead sailor before him. He underscored his demand, escort me to Admiral Tyrion. All around him after riding a small boat, the undead sailors, their once human forms marred by hideous disfigurement, watched Eddie with an intensity that suggested they were observing a creature of rare and exotic nature. The secretary, accustomed to the relative tranquility of an office, found their unblinking gazes discomforting and unnerving as the legends suggested. In a voice thickened and twisted by the ravages of undeath, one bloated sailor addressed Eddie, an unexpected note of surprise coloring his words. I really didn't expect you to come alone, he said. Our captain specified that 3 individuals were permitted to come on board. Eddie responded with a dismissive shake of his head. The difference between 3 people and 1 is negligible, he said. Had Admiral Tyrion permitted it, I would have gladly brought along an entire delegation of advisors and assistants. But with a limit of just 3, it's as good as coming alone. A harsh, wheezing laugh erupted from one of the undead sailors. You could have brought 2 soldiers for moral support. I have no need to shore up my courage, soldiers would serve no purpose, Eddie replied, his tone brooking no argument. His steadfast demeanor did nothing to endear him to the undead sailors, prompting one to mumble disdainfully from the bowels of the small boat, just a grandstanding bureaucrat. Upon his arrival, Tyrion was met by an envoy from the city-state, a man in his prime, impeccably dressed in a suit, sporting gold-rimmed glasses and hair combed to precision, looking as though he had just stepped out of an afternoon tea break at an office. The fact that the envoy was alone left the grizzled pirate somewhat perplexed and even a touch disconcerted. He had anticipated the first envoy to board the Sea Mist to be a military representative. Quickly, however, Tyrion discerned the strategy behind the city-state's decision. The strained relationship between the Mist Fleet and the city-state, sitting on a ticking time bomb for half a century, had escalated to a tipping point. In such a precarious climate, dispatching more military personnel would serve no purpose. On the other hand, sending a bureaucrat seemed to offer a glimmer of conciliation. On the deck of the Sea Mist, Tyrion took a moment to study the diplomat from the city-state. He noted the taut nerves behind the man's attempts to project calmness despite the irregular breathing patterns. It's a good attempt, but this facade was ineffective against a captain who led an undead armada. Tyrion could even detect each thud of the man's anxious heart. Similarly, Eddie took the opportunity to size up the pirate who stood before him, this man who had once fought for the city-state but had since transformed into the embodiment of nightmares for the residents of Frost. Tall and imposing, silent yet commanding respect, with a single eye that radiated a penetrating, evaluating gaze, each look felt as though he was passing judgment. Standing in front of the formidable pirate, even the simple act of breathing felt like a monumental effort for Eddie. Admiral Tyrion, Eddie took a moment to draw a few deep, steadying breaths, standing as tall as he could to face the pirate's assessing gaze. I am here on behalf of Frost to formally greet you. It is indeed an honor to set foot on this legendary battleship. Half a century, Tyrion replied, maintaining his composure as he looked down at the somewhat shorter man. It took Frost that long to finally find the courage to engage in a dialogue with me. Eddie was unfazed by the baiting tone in Tyrion's words. Keeping his composure, he continued, I'm here on a mission. We can't deny that there are underlying tensions between Frost and the Mist Fleet, but that's not the purpose of my visit today. You must be well aware of the current predicaments the city-state finds itself embroiled in. We're here to discern the intentions of the Mist Fleet, specifically, Admiral Tyrion, we'd like to understand what your aims are and what you're planning to do. Admiral, discard that title, it brings me no pleasure, Tyrion replied, briefly glancing at Eddie before slowly pacing towards the ship's edge. As for my intentions, aren't they obvious? I've established a blockade around your city-state, now teetering on the brink of collapse, to contain your problems and prevent them from impacting my trading partners in the cold sea. Trading partners? Eddie questioned. I believe it's an accurate descriptor. They offer payment, and in return, the Mist Fleet ensures their safe passage through the treacherous waters of the cold sea, Tyrion replied, turning back to face Eddie. Don't you agree that it's a mutually beneficial trade relationship? A slight twitch tugged at the corner of Eddie's mouth, but he swiftly concealed the fleeting expression. Casting a cursory glance at the undead sailors surrounding them, he gradually made his way closer to Tyrion. Are you implying that your intention is merely to assist Frost in managing this crisis? That's quite a self-serving interpretation, but if it comforts you to think so, then it doesn't really matter, Tyrion responded nonchalantly. I don't require anything from you, only that you avoid causing any further complications. Eddie remained silent for a couple of beats before cautiously posing another question. Might I inquire why you are willing to extend your assistance? Tyrion, leaning against the ship's railing with his back to Eddie, responded, is the rationale truly of such importance? I need a valid reason to present to my superiors and colleagues. It would help to put their minds at ease. Ah, Mr. Eddie, so you require a reason that is palatable to your people, Tyrion chuckled, turning his gaze back to Eddie. Then I shall provide you with a justification, it's simply a command given by my late father. Eddie was momentarily taken aback. Seconds later, his expression morphed into one of utter astonishment. You seem to have caught on. Yes, it was indeed my father's command. Consider it a directive from the ghost of subspace. He instructed me to lay siege to your rather pitiful city-state, so go relay this to your superiors. The Mist Fleet is merely implementing a command from subspace, Tyrion said, a playful lilt in his tone. That should allow them to rest easy. Tyrion's amusement was quite apparent, reflecting in his gleaming eyes. Eddie finally managed a response, or so he believed. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and wiped away the sweat beading on his brow. That's quite a tall tale, Captain Tyrion. I comprehend your sentiment. If you choose not to elaborate further, I shan't pry. Tyrion calmly observed the diplomat from Frost before him, and after a moment of contemplation, he clicked his tongue in disapproval. Truth seems to have lost its appeal in this day and age. Yet, he found himself in high spirits. Observing this straight-laced senior official from Frost unravel before him was quite the spectacle. Your presence is no longer required, Mr. Eddie, he said, maintaining a polite demeanor. We don't have a dinner planned for you on board. Eddie appeared taken aback. Ah. Hold on, I still have. You might be brimming with questions concerning the future of the Mist Fleet, the issues surrounding Dagger Island, the Queen of Bygone Times, and the Abyss Project, but I have little to divulge to Frost, Tyrion stated calmly. You've accomplished your goal, fulfilled your mission. Return and report to your superiors. In future, if there are any concerns, they may directly reach out to us via radio. There's no need to send anyone, any open frequency will suffice. Eddie was momentarily stunned but quickly gathered his wits, a spark of relief flashing across his face. Ah, very well, Captain Tyrion, I greatly appreciate your understanding. But he paused as if a sudden thought had occurred to him, then hurriedly continued. Ah, hold on, there's one more question, the final one. Tyrion arched an eyebrow in interest. Oh. Regarding the mysterious light signal you dispatched towards our scout boat earlier, Eddie appeared somewhat awkward, meticulously picking his words. We invested a considerable amount of time decoding it upon our return. Tyrion remained silent, merely observing Mr. Envoy before him until Eddie began to squirm under his gaze. Then, Tyrion broke out into a sudden smile. It was merely a malfunction due to lackluster maintenance by the sailors. Eddie. Tyrion finally couldn't hold back his laughter. Eddie's face went through a spectrum of expressions, his hand absent-mindedly adjusting the buttons on his suit, but gradually, he too joined in, his laughter mingling with Tyrion's boisterous guffaws. But Tyrion's laughter abruptly ceased. He extended a hand, placing a firm pat on the shoulder of the diplomat from Frost, standing before him. They've chosen well, Mr. Eddie. You're a man of quality. I was nearly persuaded to offer you an invitation to join us for dinner. Regrettably, I must return to my ship without delay. The mirth in Eddie's voice faded, and he gently shook his head. The anxiety runs high among my people. We can't afford to expend all our energy on fostering mutual distrust and conjecture. Tyrion remained silent, merely offering a slight nod and gesturing towards the side, signaling that it was time for his guest to depart. Eddie returned the gesture with a subtle nod of his own, then straightened his suit and adjusted his bow tie, ready to traverse the ladder leading off the ship's deck. However, something unusual in his peripheral vision halted his progress. Caught off guard, the ambassador from Frost gravitated towards the ship's railing, peering down at the sea in bewilderment. Captain Tyrion, what is that? Tyrion knitted his brows in confusion, directing his gaze towards where Eddie was pointing. What he saw then was an unusual shadow. Beneath the rolling sea surface, at a depth difficult to estimate, a nebulous shadow was darting across the expansive space between the sea mist and a handful of escort vessels, propelling towards the horizon. The shadow appeared ethereal and translucent, reminiscent of the reflected image of a ship in the water, albeit devoid of any discernible structure. Tyrion studied it for a while, but all he could determine was that it seemed to resemble the hull of a ship, as though an inverted vessel was sailing under the water's surface. Tyrion redirected his gaze upwards, staring intently at the direction towards which the shadow was heading, Dagger Island.